It is April 1994. The Cold War is dead. The Soviet Union has collapsed, and the United States of America stands alone as the undisputed master of the globe. There is no rival superpower, no economic competitor that can challenge the hegemony of Washington. In this era of absolute American dominance, when the president speaks, the world listens, obeys, and trembles. But on this humid spring day in the Oval Office, President Bill Clinton is not discussing nuclear disarmament or a major trade deal. He is staring at a briefing regarding a small island nation in Southeast Asia, a dot on the map that many Americans couldn't even locate. The president steps up to the microphones, the eyes of the entire Western media apparatus fixed upon him, and he issues a direct public challenge. He speaks about a teenager named Michael Fay. Clinton does not mince words. He calls the punishment that Singapore has prepared for this American boy extreme and a mistake. It is a diplomatic shot across the bow. It is a polite but firm ultimatum from the Caesar of the modern world to a tiny city-state. Do not touch our citizen. The atmosphere in Washington is hysterical. The American media machine is running at full capacity, painting Singapore not as a modern economic miracle, but as a barbaric dungeon from the Dark Ages. The New York Times, the talk shows, the Senate floor, they are all screaming one word: torture. They demand that the president use his immense leverage to stop what they perceive as a medieval atrocity. The narrative is set. How could a country with a population smaller than Brooklyn possibly dare to defy the will of the United States? The expectation is clear. Singapore will fold. They have to. Their economy relies on American trade. Their security relies on the American Navy passing through their waters. To say no to Bill Clinton in 1994 is considered diplomatic suicide. The world watches, waiting for the apology, waiting for the release of Michael Fay, waiting for the small nation to remember its place in the pecking order. 10,000 miles away, in the pristine, air-conditioned corridors of power in Singapore, there is no panic. There is only a cold, calculating silence. Kuan, the founding father and now senior minister, sits in the center of the storm. He is not a man who is easily rattled by newspaper headlines, nor is he impressed by the moral posturing of Western liberals. While the American press screams about human rights, Lee Kuan Yew is thinking about survival. He looks at the situation not as a case of vandalism, but as a test of Singapore's sovereignty. He understands something that the analysts in Washington fail to grasp. If Singapore bends the knee now, if they make an exception for Michael Fay simply because he holds an American passport, the entire social fabric of the nation unravels. The tension in the cabinet room is palpable. The question on everyone's mind is terrifying in its simplicity. Is it worth it? Is it really worth risking the wrath of the United States, risking sanctions, risking the collapse of the stock market, all for the sake of 6 lashes on the buttocks of a teenage vandal? The pragmatic choice, the easy choice, would be to deport the boy and let the Americans have their victory. It would cost nothing. It would satisfy the president. It would make the headlines go away. But Lee Kuan Yew knows that the easy choice is the fatal choice. He built Singapore on a foundation of iron discipline and the absolute rule of law. If the law applies only to the poor Asian worker, but not to the wealthy white expat, then Singapore is not a country. It is a colony. The decision crystallizes in the mind of the leadership. This is no longer about Michael Fay. This is a collision of civilizations. It is a confrontation between the Western belief in the supreme rights of the individual and the Asian belief in the sanctity of the community. Lee Kuan Yew smiles a thin, grim smile. He knows the Americans are bluffing. He knows they are arrogant. And he knows that for all their aircraft carriers and economic might, they cannot force him to break his own laws within his own borders. The world expects a surrender, but Lee Kuan Yew is preparing to send a message that will echo through history. He looks at the demand from the White House, the plea from the most powerful man on earth, and prepares to do the unthinkable. He prepares to say no. To understand the sheer magnitude of the collision that was about to happen, one must first step back into the unique atmosphere of Singapore in 1993. It was often described by Western observers as Disneyland with the death penalty, a gleaming, futuristic metropolis rising from the tropics, where everything worked with Swiss precision. The streets were not just clean, they were clinically sterile. The skyscrapers of the central business district gleamed under the equatorial sun, projecting an image of immense wealth and stability. But this paradise was not accidental. It was engineered. It was the physical manifestation of Lee Kuan Yew's ironclad philosophy. He believed that order was the precursor to liberty, not the other way around. His government operated on an extreme version of the broken windows theory long before it became popular in American policing. The idea was simple and ruthless. If you tolerate graffiti, you invite theft. If you tolerate theft, you invite murder. Therefore, in Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore, there were no small crimes. Every infraction, no matter how minor, was treated as a direct assault on the social order. Chewing gum was banned to protect public property. Littering carried heavy fines. The state was a strict father, and the citizens were expected to be obedient children. It was a society where the collective good always suffocated individual expression, a place where you traded your right to dissent for the right to walk the streets at 3 a.m. without fear of being mugged. And to this meticulously curated garden came the American expatriates. In the early 90s, as the Asian economic tigers roared, Western executives flocked to Singapore, bringing their families, their wealth, and their cultural baggage with them. They lived in a bubble of luxury that insulated them from the hard realities of local law. They resided in sprawling condominiums with pools and tennis courts, drove imported European cars, and sent their children to the Singapore American School. This school was an enclave of Western liberalism in the heart of an authoritarian state. Inside its gates, the kids wore baggy jeans, listened to grunge music, and mimicked the slang of American teenagers. They lived in Singapore physically, but mentally, they were in the suburbs of Connecticut or California. They were third culture kids, floating above the local population, looking down from their high-rise balconies. A dangerous sense of invincibility permeated this community. They believed, consciously or subconsciously, that the harsh laws of Singapore applied to the locals, not to them. They were guests of honor, essential to the economy, protected by the mighty shield of the American passport. They believed that if they ever got into trouble, a phone call from a CEO father or a visit from the U.S. Embassy would make the problem disappear. Michael Fay was the archetype of this lost generation of expat youth. He was 18 years old, a boy drifting through the humidity of the tropics with a chip on his shoulder. His background was marked by the scars of a difficult divorce and a diagnosis of ADHD, a condition that was barely understood and largely stigmatized at the time. He had moved to Singapore to live with his mother and stepfather, dragging his personal turmoil across the ocean. He was not a hardened criminal, nor was he a gangster in the traditional sense. He was a bored, angsty teenager seeking validation. In a city where conformity was the highest virtue, Michael Fay sought attention through rebellion. He fell in with a group of like-minded teenagers, boys who felt suffocated by the perfect, rule-bound society around them. They were looking for a rush, a way to assert dominance over a system that seemed too perfect to be real. For Fay and his friends, vandalism became a sport. It started small, a way to puncture the boredom of the tropical nights. They viewed Singapore not as a sovereign nation with fearsome laws, but as a sterile canvas begging to be defaced. They egged houses, switched license plates, and tore down government signs. But soon the game escalated. The targets became the prized possessions of the wealthy. Luxury cars. They slashed tires and spray-painted vehicles, leaving jagged scars on the symbols of Singaporean success. To them it was a prank, a senior year antic to brag about. They laughed about it, unaware that they were dancing on the edge of a volcano. The arrogance of their actions was breathtaking. They assumed that because they were white, wealthy, and American, the rules of the game were different for them. They treated the city-state as their personal playground, failing to realize that in the eyes of the Singaporean police, they were not privileged kids acting out. They were foreign vandals attacking the property of citizens. The expat bubble had blinded them to the reality of where they actually were. They were not in a suburb of Los Angeles. They were in the domain of Kuan, a man who had spent a lifetime crushing communists, communal rioters, and political opponents. These teenagers believed they were untouchable, but they were about to discover that in Singapore, the law does not care about your father's job title, and the cane does not discriminate based on the color of your passport. The wave of destruction that swept through the upscale neighborhoods of Singapore in late 1993 was not merely a series of pranks. It was a calculated assault on the property and peace of the city's elite. To understand why the Singaporean public and eventually the government reacted with such cold fury, one must strip away the Western media's later portrayal of Michael Fay as a harmless, artistic teenager. There was no art involved in what happened during those humid nights. It was raw, malicious vandalism. Residents of the prestigious Tanglin area, a leafy district home to diplomats and wealthy expatriates, woke up morning after morning to find their prized possessions desecrated. Luxury vehicles, Mercedes-Benzes, BMWs, and Jaguars were found covered in red spray paint, their sleek bodies marred by crude lines and nonsensical scrawls. But the damage went deeper than surface-level graffiti. Tires were slashed with knives, leaving the vehicles crippled on the asphalt. Hot tar remover was thrown onto car bonnets, eating into the paintwork and causing thousands of dollars in permanent damage. In some instances, eggs were pelted at the facades of pristine homes, baking into the stucco under the tropical heat. This was not the work of a misunderstood creative spirit. It was the behavior of a gang deriving pleasure from destruction. For the victims, many of whom were foreign dignitaries or high-ranking executives, this was a violation of the unspoken contract they had signed with Singapore. They paid high taxes and accepted strict laws in exchange for absolute safety and order. That contract had been breached. The Singapore police force is not an organization that takes kindly to being mocked. In a city-state that prides itself on ubiquitous surveillance and low crime rates, a spree of unsolved vandalism is viewed as a direct challenge to the competence of the state. The police did not view these acts as isolated incidents of teenage rebellion. They saw a pattern. They launched a meticulous investigation, employing the kind of rigor usually reserved for serious organized crime. They mapped the locations of the vandalism, tracked the times of the incidents, and began to close the net. They knew that the perpetrators were likely expatriates, given the neighborhoods targeted and the lack of fear shown by the vandals. The breakthrough came not through high-tech forensics, but through old-fashioned police work and the breaking of weak links. The police set up ambushes and stackouts in the affected areas. Eventually, they apprehended a 16-year-old suspect from Hong Kong, Xu Chi-ho. Under questioning, the dominoes began to fall. The code of silence that the teenagers thought would protect them crumbled almost instantly under the pressure of a real criminal investigation. Xu named names, and at the top of that list was Michael Fay. When the police arrived at Michael Fay's apartment, they did not need to search hard to find evidence. Fay had not just committed crimes, he had kept trophies. His bedroom was a veritable museum of stolen state property. The officers found a horde of street signs that had been wrenched from their posts. No smoking signs, exit signs, and Singaporean flags that had been torn down from public buildings. The discovery of these items was devastating to any defense his lawyers might have hoped to mount. Possession of stolen government property is a serious offense in itself, but in the context of the vandalism investigation, it painted a picture of a young man who had a compulsive need to steal and destroy. It destroyed the narrative of a one-time mistake. The sheer volume of the stolen items suggested a long-term pattern of disregard for the law. The physical evidence was irrefutable. The police had the spray paint cans, they had the tools, and in Fay's room, they had the stolen property that linked him directly to the chaotic spree that had terrorized the neighborhood. The final nail in the coffin was the interrogation. Taken to the police station, Fay was subjected to the harsh reality of the Singaporean justice system. This was not a counselor's office in an American high school where he could talk his way out of trouble with a charming smile or a promise to do better. This was a cold, sterile room designed to extract the truth. What happened inside that room remains a subject of controversy. Fay later claimed he was slapped and coerced, physically intimidated into confessing to crimes he didn't commit. The Singaporean authorities vehemently denied this, stating that the interrogation was standard and procedural. However, the result was a signed confession. In the eyes of the Singaporean legal system, that signature was binding. Fay admitted to dozens of acts of vandalism, at that moment terrified and perhaps still believing that his American citizenship would shield him from the worst consequences. He sealed his fate. He likely expected a fine, a deportation order, or a stern lecture. He did not realize that by signing that piece of paper, he had just admitted to offenses that carried a mandatory sentence of corporal punishment. The trap had snapped shut. The police had their man, they had the evidence, and they had the confession. The harmless pranks were over, and the machinery of the state was about to grind into motion. The news of Michael Fay's sentence did not merely trickle into the United States. It exploded with the force of a cultural bombshell. In the spring of 1994, the American media machine, arguably the most powerful entity on the planet, turned its collective gaze towards Singapore, and what it saw filled it with self-righteous horror. To the Western liberal mind, the concept of judicial caning was not just a punishment. It was a relic of a dark, forgotten past, something that belonged in the dungeons of the Middle Ages, not in a modern metropolis of glass and steel. The reaction was visceral and immediate. The editorial pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times erupted in a chorus of condemnation. They did not speak of corporal punishment. They spoke of torture. They painted vivid, bloody pictures of flesh being torn from bone, of permanent scarring of a brutality that was fundamentally incompatible with civilized society. The word barbaric became the adjective of choice. Television personalities like Larry King dedicated primetime segments to the issue, inviting experts to dissect the anatomy of the rattan cane and the psychological trauma it would inflict on an American teenager. The narrative was singular and overwhelming. Singapore was a draconian police state that had no respect for human rights, and Michael Fay was a victim of a cruel, unfeeling system. This media firestorm was not just about the welfare of one boy. It was a projection of the West's ideological supremacy. In 1994, the end of history narrative was at its peak. Communism had fallen, and the American way liberal democracy combined with individual human rights was assumed to be the final, perfect form of human government. The idea that a wealthy, modern nation like Singapore would reject these values was baffling and offensive to American commentators. Columnists like William Safire of the New York Times led the charge, attacking Lee Kuan Yew personally and suggesting that Singapore's prosperity was built on a foundation of fear and repression. The unspoken assumption was that the United States held the moral high ground, that its system of justice, focused on rehabilitation and rights, was objectively superior. The American public was whipped into a frenzy of moral panic. They saw the caning not as a legal sanction for crime, but as a violation of the sacred American body. The thought that an American citizen could be subjected to physical pain by a foreign government was an affront to the national ego. It was a clash of civilizations played out on cable news, a collision between the Western obsession with the individual and the Eastern obsession with the collective. However, if the American media expected Lee Kuan Yew to wither under this barrage of criticism, they had severely misjudged their opponent. Lee Kuan Yew did not apologize. He did not retreat. Instead, he used the Michael Fay affair as a platform to articulate a counter-philosophy that would come to be known as Asian values. For Lee, the Western outcry was not a sign of moral superiority, but a symptom of moral decay. He argued that the West had fundamentally lost its way by placing the rights of the individual above the welfare of the society. In his view, a society that prioritized the criminal's right to a lenient sentence over the community's right to safety was a society in decline. Lee Kuan Yew's response was intellectual, cold, and devastatingly precise. He posited that the fundamental duty of a government is not to coddle offenders, but to ensure that the vast majority of law-abiding citizens can live their lives without fear. He looked at the Western model and saw weakness, a lack of discipline that was slowly eating away at the social fabric. This was the core of the philosophical battle. Lee Kuan Yew argued that human rights were not universal in the way the West defined them. He believed that in the context of Asian society, specifically in a dense, multicultural city-state like Singapore, the right to be safe from vandalism, theft, and violence superseded the right of a vandal to be treated with kid gloves. He famously challenged the American definition of a civilized society. In interviews and speeches, he posed a question that struck at the heart of the American insecurity. If you cannot walk down your own streets at night without fear of being mugged, are you truly free? He argued that the American obsession with individual liberty had created a chaotic, dangerous environment where the innocent were prisoners in their own homes, while criminals roamed free on bail. For Lee, the cane was not an instrument of torture, but an instrument of order. It was a deterrent. It was a sharp, painful reminder that actions have consequences, a lesson he believed the West had forgotten how to teach. The hypocrisy of the American position was a weapon that Kuan and his ministers wielded with surgical skill. While the U.S. media was screaming about the barbarity of 4 lashes with a cane, the United States itself was in the grip of a terrifying epidemic of violence. In 1994, American cities were war zones. The crime rate was astronomical. The crack cocaine epidemic had devastated communities. Schools in major cities had metal detectors because students were bringing guns to class. The riots in Los Angeles following the Rodney King verdict were still a fresh memory. Images of burning buildings and lawlessness burned into the global consciousness. Kuan pointed to this reality and asked a simple, cutting question. Is this the model you want us to follow? He highlighted the absurdity of a nation where thousands were murdered, annually lecturing a nation with one of the lowest crime rates in the world on how to manage its justice system. The contrast was stark and undeniable. In Singapore, women could jog alone in the parks at midnight. Children took public transport to school without supervision. There were no graffiti-covered subways, no drug dealers on the corners, no fear in the air. This safety was not accidental. It was purchased with the currency of strict laws and harsh punishments. Kuan argued that the West was suffering from a moral sclerosis, a condition where the elite were so concerned with the theoretical rights of the accused that they had abandoned their responsibility to the victim. He suggested that the American system had become a mockery of justice, a revolving door where criminals were arrested, processed, and released to offend again, while society slowly crumbled. The Michael Fay case, therefore, became a mirror. When the Americans looked at Singapore, they saw a dungeon. But when Kuan looked at America, he saw a lunatic asylum where the inmates had taken over. This deep philosophical divide turned the Michael Fay incident into something far larger than a vandalism case. It became a referendum on the future of governance. Kuan was proposing that the Western model of liberal democracy was not the only path to modernity, and perhaps not even the best one. He was championing a model of soft authoritarianism, where the government acted as a strict patriarch, making hard decisions for the greater good. He challenged the West's arrogance, suggesting that perhaps, just perhaps, a society needs a measure of fear to function. He argued that order does not occur naturally. It must be enforced. The Asian values debate that exploded from this incident forced Western intellectuals to confront uncomfortable truths about their own societies. It exposed the fragility of the Western claim to moral universalism. By refusing to bow to American pressure, Kuan was not just defending a punishment. He was defending the right of an Asian nation to define its own morality, its own laws, and its own destiny, free from the hegemonic lectures of a West that could not even keep its own house in order. The clash was total. Individualism versus communitarianism, rights versus responsibilities, liberty versus order. And in the center of this geopolitical storm stood Michael Fay, the unintended symbol of a debate that would define the relationship between East and West for decades to come. The diplomatic atmosphere shifted from a media circus to a high-stakes geopolitical standoff the moment the stationery of the White House was placed on the desk. Until this point, the Michael Fay affair had been a war of words played out in newspapers and television studios. But when President Bill Clinton decided to personally intervene, he transformed a local criminal case into a test of wills between a superpower and a sovereign city-state. In political terms, Clinton's decision to write directly to Singapore's president, Ong Teng Cheong, was a significant escalation. It was also, in the eyes of Lee Kuan Yew, a strategic blunder. By placing his personal prestige on the line for a teenage vandal, Clinton had backed himself and Singapore into a corner. A request from the President of the United States is not merely a suggestion. In the geopolitical reality of the 1990s, it was a command. The implication was clear. The leader of the free world was asking for a favor, and the refusal of such a favor would be viewed as a personal insult to the office of the presidency. The pressure coming from Washington was not limited to the polite phrasing of a diplomatic letter. Behind the scenes, the machinery of American coercion was beginning to turn. In the halls of Congress, senators and representatives, eager to look tough on human rights for their constituents, began to float the idea of consequences. There were whispers of trade sanctions, of blocking Singaporean exports, of reviewing military cooperation. For Singapore, this was not an idle threat. It was an existential nightmare. The island nation possesses no natural resources. It survives entirely on trade, on the free flow of capital, and on its reputation as a safe harbor for Western investment. The United States was its largest trading partner and its security guarantor. A trade war with the U.S. would not just hurt the economy, it would obliterate it. The sheer asymmetry of the conflict was terrifying. The United States could crush Singapore's economy without losing a percentage point of its own GDP. The American eagle was sharpening its talons, ready to squeeze the small lion city until it capitulated. Inside the Istana, the official residence and office of the Singaporean government, the air was thick with tension. While Goh Chok Tong was the prime minister and the official head of government, the presence of Lee Kuan Yew, then senior minister, loomed large over the crisis cabinet. They were faced with a dilemma that seemed to have no winning outcome. It was a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. If they ignored Clinton and carried out the full sentence, they risked the economic wrath of the United States and a diplomatic freeze that could last for years. However, the alternative was even more dangerous to the soul of the nation. If they capitulated, if they released Michael Fay or commuted his sentence to a mere fine simply because the American president asked, they would destroy the very foundation of Singapore's success. Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Chok Tong understood that Singapore's only true asset was its credibility. The country was built on the absolute, unwavering rule of law. The law in Singapore was draconian, yes, but it was fair. It applied to the Chinese coolie, the Malay driver, the Indian merchant, and the wealthy British banker equally. If the government were to carve out an exception for Michael Fay, they would be admitting to their own people and to their neighbors in Malaysia and Indonesia that Singapore was a client state of the U.S., a colony in all but name, where white skin granted immunity from the law. The internal credibility of the People's Action Party would be shattered. How could they ever again sentence a local boy to the cane if they had let the American boy walk free? The social compact that held the multi-ethnic society together, the promise that the law is blind, would be broken. The discussions in the cabinet were intense and calculating. They analyzed the psychology of the Americans. Lee Kuan Yew, a keen observer of Western politics, understood that Clinton was acting largely for domestic consumption. He needed to appear strong and compassionate to his voters, when he likely did not want to blow up the strategic alliance in Southeast Asia over a teenager who was, by all accounts, guilty, the Singaporean leadership realized they needed a third option. They needed a way to say no to the demand for total clemency while still offering a gesture that allowed Clinton to save face. They had to thread the needle between defiance and diplomacy. They needed a solution that upheld the sovereignty of Singapore's judicial system while acknowledging the request of a friendly head of state. The solution they arrived at was a masterstroke of Machiavellian brilliance. It was a compromise that was not really a compromise at all. The government announced that out of respect for President Clinton and the long-standing friendship between the two nations, they would recommend a reduction in the sentence. They would not cancel the caning. They would not deport Fay immediately. Instead, they would reduce the number of lashes from 6 to 4. To the casual observer, this might have looked like a concession. In reality, it was a polite, steely-eyed refusal. The difference between 6 lashes and 4 lashes is mathematical, but the difference between 0 lashes and 4 lashes is absolute. By keeping the punishment of caning, Singapore was declaring that the American president could not stop the execution of their law. The physical act of the cane striking flesh would still happen. The humiliation of the vandal would still occur. The precedent would stand. This decision was a gamble of the highest order. It was a soft no. It gave Clinton an out. He could tell the American press that he had successfully intervened and secured a reduction in the sentence, spinning it as a partial victory. Yet in Singapore, the message was crystal clear. We listened to the president. We gave him a token gesture of respect, but we are still going to beat this boy. It was a demonstration of supreme confidence. Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Chok Tong were betting that the United States, for all its bluster, would not actually impose sanctions over a reduction in sentence. They bet that the Americans would grumble, protest, and eventually move on. It was a maneuver that required nerves of steel. They were effectively telling the most powerful man on earth, "We hear you, Mr. President, but in this House, we make the rules." The reduction was the velvet glove. The 4 lashes were the iron fist inside it. The date was set, the cane was prepared, and the Singaporean government waited to see if the American giant would strike back or if the gamble would pay off. The compromise had secured the one thing that mattered most to Lee Kuan Yew, the supremacy of Singaporean law within Singaporean borders. The date is May 5, 1994. The location is the Queenstown Remand Prison, a facility that defies the Western imagination of a tropical dungeon. There are no dark, dripping cobwebs, no rusted chains, and no shadows hiding sadists. Instead, the environment is terrifyingly clinical. It is sterile, bathed in the harsh, unforgiving hum of fluorescent lighting, smelling faintly of industrial disinfectant and fear. This is not a torture chamber. It is an operating theater of pain. The bureaucracy of Singapore does not act with passion. It acts with procedure. Michael Fay, the teenager who had become the center of a global geopolitical storm, is no longer a political symbol or a headline. In this room, he is simply a prisoner, a biological entity subject to the penal code. The bravado of the vandal, the arrogance of the expat, and the hope of presidential intervention have all evaporated. All that remains is the cold reality of the Singaporean judicial system, which is about to extract its payment in flesh. The instrument of punishment, the rattan cane, has been prepared with the meticulous care of a surgical tool. It is not a whip, nor is it a simple stick. It is a specific length of rattan, approximately 1.2 meters long and over a centimeter thick. It is not dry wood. For days prior to the execution of the sentence, the cane has been submerged in water. This is not a ritual. It is physics. The water saturates the fibers, making the cane heavier and more pliable. A dry cane might shatter upon impact, dissipating the energy. A soaked cane does not break. It absorbs the kinetic energy of the executioner's swing and transfers it entirely into the target, wrapping around the curve of the buttocks to ensure that the point of highest velocity bites deep. Furthermore, the cane has been treated with antiseptic. The state intends to inflict pain and leave a scar, but it does not intend to cause gangrene or infection. It is a paradox of care and cruelty that defines the entire process. The executioner is not a hooded thug. He is a fit, athletic officer of the prison service, chosen for his physical strength and coordination. He is trained in martial arts, specifically for this task. He does not simply hit the prisoner. He performs a calculated athletic movement. He stands at a precise distance from the trestle, measuring his stride. The technique involves using the entire body weight, pivoting at the hip, and stepping forward to generate maximum velocity. The goal is to deliver a strike of consistent shattering force. He is disciplined, silent, and focused. There is no anger in his eyes, only the professional detachment of a man doing his job. Beside him stands a medical doctor, a jarring presence that reinforces the clinical nature of the punishment. The doctor is there to ensure the prisoner does not die, to check the heart rate, and to certify that the body can withstand the next blow. Michael Fay is led into the room and stripped. He is instructed to bend over a wooden trestle, an A-frame structure padded, to prevent accidental injury to the head or limbs during the violent convulsions that will follow. He is strapped down tightly. His wrists are bound and his ankles are secured. The immobilization is crucial. If he moves, the cane could hit the wrong spot. A protective shield is placed over his lower back, covering the kidneys. This detail is perhaps the most chilling of all. The Singaporean state has calculated exactly how much damage it wishes to inflict. The kidneys are vital organs. Damaging them could be fatal or cause permanent disability. The buttocks, however, are soft tissue. They can be traumatized, flayed, and scarred without threatening the life of the prisoner. The exposure is total. The target area is isolated. Michael Fay is now helpless, staring at the wooden frame, waiting for a sound he has never heard before. The room goes silent. The executioner takes his stance. Then the first lash comes. It happens faster than the eye can follow, a blur of motion accompanied by a sharp, whip-crack sound that echoes off the tiled walls. The physics of the impact are brutal. When the wet rattan strikes the skin at over 160 kilometers per hour, it does not just bruise. The skin, unable to absorb the sudden compression, splits open. Witnesses to such punishments describe the immediate aftermath of the first stroke. A white line appears across the buttocks where the blood has been forced out of the capillaries by the sheer pressure. A split second later, the blood rushes back, and the line turns a deep, angry crimson, then purple, before the skin breaks and blood begins to flow. For Michael Fay, the pain is not gradual. It is absolute and instantaneous. It is a shock to the nervous system so profound that it overrides all conscious thought. The body involuntarily spasms against the leather restraints, every muscle contracting in a futile attempt to escape the agony. There's a pause. The punishment is not delivered in a rapid frenzy. There is a count. 1. The silence returns. The executioner resets his stance. The doctor observes. This interval, perhaps 30 seconds, is psychological torture. The prisoner knows the pain that is coming. The adrenaline spike from the first hit begins to fade, replaced by the throbbing, burning reality of the open wound. Then the second lash. The executioner aims with terrifying accuracy, often striking the same open wound or crossing it to create an X. The skin, already traumatized, shreds further. The epidermis and dermis are pulverized, exposing the subcutaneous layer. Reports suggest that by the second or third stroke, the prisoner is often screaming, a primal, involuntary reaction to the destruction of tissue. The bravado of the teenager is gone. There is only the animalistic response to trauma. By the third and fourth lashes, the shock can cause the prisoner to enter a state of semi-consciousness. The blood runs down the legs. The body hangs limp against the straps, exhausted by the screaming and the convulsions. When the fourth stroke lands, the final one of the compromise, the ordeal ends as abruptly as it began. Michael Fay is unstrapped, his legs likely buckling under him. He is trembling, in a state of clinical shock. The doctor steps in immediately, not to comfort, but to treat. Gentian violet or a similar antiseptic solution is applied to the raw, bleeding meat of the buttocks. The sting of the chemical on the open wounds is a final, sharp coda to the punishment. He is helped away, a broken figure, to begin the slow, painful process of healing, where for weeks he will be unable to sit or sleep on his back. While this brutal theater played out within the walls of Queenstown Prison, the contrast with the outside world could not have been starker. In Washington, the media was still debating, the politicians were still posturing, and the pundits were still screaming about human rights. But in Singapore, there was only silence. Lee Kuan Yew did not issue a statement that day. He did not gloat. He did not appear on television. The silence was his loudest message. It signified that the machinery of the state he had built was functioning exactly as designed. It did not matter that the President of the United States had objected. It did not matter that the New York Times was outraged. The law had been prescribed, the sentence had been passed, and the punishment had been executed. The silence of the government was a demonstration of supreme confidence and power. The 4 lashes were not just a punishment for Michael Fay. They were the sound of a small nation slamming the door in the face of the West, proving that on this island the will of the United States ended where the sovereignty of Singapore began. In June 1994, the iron gates of the Queenstown Remand Prison opened, and Michael Fay stepped back into the blinding tropical sunlight. He was a free man, but he was physically marked. He walked with a noticeable limp, unable to sit comfortably. The fresh scars on his buttocks, a visceral reminder of the 4 strokes of the rattan cane he had endured. In Singapore, his release was treated with the same bureaucratic efficiency as his incarceration. There were no parades, no speeches, and no government officials present to bid him farewell. To the Singaporean state, the transaction was complete. The crime had been committed. The debt had been paid in blood and time, and the ledger was now balanced. The country simply turned its back and went back to work. The Michael Fay affair, which had consumed the world's attention for months, was over the moment his plane lifted off the tarmac at Changi Airport. The island nation returned to its quiet, disciplined rhythm, having proven its point to the world. However, the moment Michael Fay landed in the United States, he was not treated as a convicted vandal returning home in disgrace. He was greeted as a returning prisoner of war, a martyr who had survived the dungeons of the Orient. He touched down in Dayton, Ohio, to a scene that could only be produced by the American media complex of the 1990s. The tarmac was crowded with cameras, satellite trucks, and reporters jostling for a glimpse of the victim. The narrative had been pre-written by the press. Fay was an innocent American boy who had been brutalized by a despotic regime. The context of his crimes, the destroyed property, the slashed tires, the theft was conveniently scrubbed from the story or minimized as youthful hijinks. In the eyes of the American public, encouraged by a media hungry for sensation, the villain was Kuan, and the hero was the teenager with the limp. The weeks that followed were a surreal descent into the celebrity culture of the West. Michael Fay was thrust onto the talk show circuit, the modern American equivalent of a Roman triumph. He appeared on Larry King Live, the biggest platform of the era, where he recounted the details of his punishment to a rapt audience. He described the blood, the pain, and the terror, and the audience gasped in sympathetic horror. He was offered movie deals. There were talks of book contracts. People wanted to buy the rights to his story. For a brief moment, vandalism had made him famous. The message being sent to him and to every other teenager watching was confusing and toxic. In America, if you commit a crime and get punished by foreigners, you are not a criminal. You are a celebrity. The shame that the cane was supposed to instill was washed away by the spotlight. He was coddled by a society that seemed desperate to apologize to him for what Singapore had done. But reality has a way of piercing through the distortions of television. The adrenaline of the media circus eventually faded. The cameras moved on to the next scandal, and Michael Fay was left alone with his demons in the land of the free. This was the moment of truth. The arguments made by American liberals were that Fay needed counseling, understanding, and rehabilitation, not physical pain. Now, back in the safety of the United States, surrounded by the support systems and freedoms that Lee Kuan Yew had criticized, Fay had every opportunity to turn his life around. If the American way was superior, this was the time for it to work. It did not work. Less than 4 months after his return, in September 1994, the headlines returned. But this time they were tragic rather than sensational. Michael Fay had not used his second chance to become a model citizen. He had spiraled. He was found by his father in a halfway house, suffering from chemical burns on his face and hands. He had been sniffing butane lighter fluid to get high. The image was pathetic and horrifying. The boy who had been the center of a global diplomatic incident, the boy the President of the United States had spent political capital to save, was now huffing gas in a desperate attempt to escape reality. He was admitted to a rehabilitation center in Florida for drug abuse. The victim narrative collapsed overnight. It became painfully clear that the vandalism in Singapore was not a prank, but a symptom of a deeply troubled individual that the American system was ill-equipped to handle. This rapid disintegration provided a grim retrospective validation of Lee Kuan Yew's philosophy. From his office in Singapore, the senior minister watched the fall of Michael Fay, not with malice, but with a cold, analytical confirmation of his worldview. He had argued all along that the West's approach to social order was fundamentally broken. The Americans believed that freedom and that leniency were the cures for all societal ills. They believed that by removing the fear of punishment, they allowed the human spirit to flourish. But in the case of Michael Fay, the removal of boundaries led only to self-destruction. In Singapore, Fay had been forced to face consequences. The cane was brutal, yes, but it was a definitive stop sign. It forced him to confront the reality of his actions. In America, protected by the rights culture and the media circus, he was allowed to drift until he nearly killed himself. The contrast was devastating. Singapore had been accused of being barbaric for inflicting physical pain, yet Michael Fay left Singapore alive, sober, and free. The United States claimed to be civilized and humane, yet under its care, Fay descended into drug abuse and self-harm within weeks. Who, then, was truly cruel? Was it the strict father who disciplined the child to keep him on the straight path, or the permissive parent who let the child play with fire until he burned himself? The tragic postscript of Michael Fay's life in America, which included subsequent arrests for petty crimes in the years that followed, served as a silent vindication of the Asian values that the West had so loudly mocked. The circus had packed up and left town, leaving behind a broken young man and a realization that perhaps, in the harsh calculus of survival, the dictator in Singapore understood human nature better than the pundits in Washington. Singapore had punished his body, but the American indulgence had nearly destroyed his soul. 30 years have passed since the cane cracked against the flesh of Michael Fay, and the geopolitical dust has long since settled. Looking back through the lens of history, the question of who won the war between the United States and Singapore is no longer a matter of debate. In 1994, the world expected the giant to crush the ant. They expected the economic might of America to force the tiny island nation into submission. But when the smoke cleared, it was the giant that had blinked. The Michael Fay affair stands today not as a story of cruelty, but as the ultimate case study in national sovereignty. It was the moment Singapore transitioned from a former colony trying to survive into a nation that demanded to be treated as an equal. Kuan had gambled the entire reputation of his country on a single principle, that the law of Singapore applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. By executing the sentence, he proved that his country was not a vassal state, a holiday resort for Westerners, or a strategic pawn that could be bullied by the White House. He proved that justice in Singapore was not for sale, not even for the President of the United States. Perhaps the most ironic twist of this entire saga was the reaction of the American people themselves. While the editorial boards of the New York Times and the pundits in Washington were screaming about torture and barbarism, a very different phenomenon was occurring in the mailrooms of the Singaporean embassy in Washington, D.C. They were flooded with thousands of letters, but these were not letters of hate. They were letters of support. The silent majority of Americans, the shopkeepers in Ohio, the factory workers in Detroit, the parents in the suburbs, were writing to Kuan to say, "You are right." They looked at their own country, plagued by crime, vandalism, and a lack of consequences, and they looked at Singapore with envy. They saw a leader who had the courage to do what American politicians were too afraid to do, punish the guilty. Kuan had exposed a deep fracture in the American psyche. He showed that while the American elite preached liberalism and leniency, the American people were starving for order and discipline. The humiliation of the Clinton administration was total. They had tried to lecture a foreign leader on morality, only to find that their own citizens preferred the dictator's justice. In the end, Michael Fay was a footnote, a pawn in a much larger game of chess that Kuan played with master precision. The legacy of those 4 lashes is the legacy of a man who understood the nature of power better than anyone else in the 20th century. He understood that respect is not given, it is taken. He understood that if he had yielded to Bill Clinton, Singapore would have forever remained a banana republic in the eyes of the West. By standing firm, he forced the world to accept Asian values, not just as a philosophy, but as a formidable geopolitical reality. He drew a line in the sand and dared the world's sole superpower to cross it. When they threatened, he did not flinch. When they cajoled, he did not smile. He simply pointed to the law books and carried out the duty of the state. The lesson remains seared into the diplomatic consciousness of the world. It serves as a reminder that size is not the only measure of strength. Conviction, unity, and an unshakable belief in one's own values can allow a small boat to weather a hurricane. Kuan looked into the eyes of the American Empire, an empire that had toppled governments and reshaped continents, and he said no. He showed that a nation's dignity is not measured by its square mileage or the size of its army, but by the integrity of its laws. As the echoes of the controversy faded, leaving a safe, prosperous, and uncompromising Singapore in its wake, the message to the West was undeniable and permanent. You may visit, you may trade, and you may prosper here, but do not mistake our hospitality for weakness. Singapore is nobody's backyard.